In the spring of 1998, 39-year-old social worker Sabrina Sanders had seen her fair share of relationships. So after her recent divorce, the Oklahoma resident was looking forward to living life on her own terms.
I had a wonderful relationship with my ex-husband, but his dreams weren't my dreams, and we were going separate ways. So I was excited about being single. I had just moved into my new place, and love was the farthest from my mind.
That is, until a handsome man in a security guard uniform approached Sabrina on moving day.
I was unloading clothes out of my car, and I had dropped some clothes. And as I reached down to pick up the clothes, I saw this man coming towards me. He had a big, beautiful smile.
The man introduced himself as Frederick G. Brooks, a 36-year-old Army officer by day and security guard by night.
He gave me his phone number and said, "I'm an officer. If you need me for anything," I live right upstairs, letting me know that he would be looking out for me. It made me feel safe because this was my first place by myself.
While settling in over the next few days, Sabrina couldn't help but notice Frederick around their apartment complex.
One morning, I noticed that Frederick was at his truck, and there was a young lady with him. And the girl appeared to be pretty young, and I thought that maybe it might have been his daughter.
Curious, she asked him about the young girl later that day.
He said she was one of his soldiers' daughters who had some issues. And he was talking to her and counseling her, and he was taking her back. I thought, wow, what a good guy.
As the weeks passed, Sabrina found herself bumping into Frederick a little more often.
A lot of times we would sit out at the pool and he would tell me, "You're such a great woman, you're beautiful, look at your body," and everything that he would tell me was just building me up.
I told Sabrina to take it slow. She just got out of a relationship. But she seemed to be happy that she had met him, and she just told me that he was a really nice guy.
I start feeling in my heart that, this is someone that I'd like to really get to know, and he seems to be very interested in me.
Sabrina soon discovered they had much in common. She opened up to Frederick about her recent divorce and her 20-year-old son.
He told me that he was also going through a divorce, and they had a little boy together, and that his oldest son lived back east.
Frederick also revealed he had been in the military for 16 years and loved computers. But his true passion was law enforcement.
His dream was to be a Texas State Trooper. I was impressed with that.
Before Sabrina knew it, they were spending every moment they could together.
I had fallen madly in love with Frederick. I wanted to be with Frederick all the time.
I'm very overprotective of my mother, but when I met Frederick, I automatically liked him. He was a perfect gentleman, and you could tell my mother was excited.
Once Frederick's divorce was final, the couple agreed it was time to take the next step in their relationship.
He said we might as well get a place together. I thought it was a good idea because we were together all the time. So we set up house and we enjoyed doing it.
And for the next 2 years, the lovebirds slowly made a nest for themselves.
I told Sabrina, I wish I could find me a man like that. I mean, he was such a great guy. He treated her like a queen. Anything that she needed, he would do.
By April 2001, Frederick was officially ready to retire from the Army. After receiving an honorable discharge a few weeks later, he decided it was time for a change of scenery.
We had recently taken a trip to Austin, Texas. He loved it. He said, "Let's make that our home." And I liked that because I would be next to my sister and he would have an opportunity to become a state trooper. I felt like that was going to be our beginning, our new start.
After Sabrina Sanders and her boyfriend Frederick Brooks moved to Austin, Texas, she noticed his perfection only became more pronounced.
Frederick loved computers, and he would fix them for my sisters, and he would put them together for my son. So he was the computer guy in the family.
But Sabrina couldn't help but notice how frequently Frederick would hole up alone in their computer room.
He was spending a lot of time in there, and I could wake up at 3 in the morning and he was still on the computer.
I set her down and I said, Sabrina, it's a big change when you get out of the military. It's like a culture shock. So just give him time to kind of move into being a civilian.
Yeah, I convinced myself that that was his hobby. So I didn't get mad at him.
And 1 month later, Sabrina forgot all about it when Frederick had a surprise for her.
We went into a jewelry store and we're looking at rings, and he tells me, pick a ring. I chose a ring, and he got on his knee and he proposed to me.
When my mother told me she was engaged, I felt like Frederick was the perfect guy for her. It made me feel wonderful that she was happy.
Life only got better for the couple when that October, Frederick received a letter from the sheriff's office that he'd been accepted into the academy. Although he was slightly disappointed when he learned he'd have to start as a jailer upon graduation.
He wasn't excited about being a jailer, but he felt like, well, I'm in and this is good.
So in the spring of 2002, after Frederick graduated from the academy, he and Sabrina went through with their planned nuptials, tying the knot in a small church wedding.
It was very, very beautiful. It was small, but it was touching. I was happy and I was excited to start my life as Mrs. Brooks.
Sabrina looked beautiful. She looked like a little young girl at her wedding. I felt like she had finally found somebody that was going to make her happy.
Unfortunately, the honeymoon didn't last long. When just a few months after the wedding, Sabrina fell ill and underwent a partial hysterectomy.
Frederick was right there when I came out of recovery, hugging me and holding me, and he was a perfect husband. And when I was discharged, he picked me up.
But the following day, her pride in Frederick quickly vanished.
He said he had to get out for a little while, and he didn't get back to the house until really late. And I was really upset. I asked him, why didn't you even call to check on me? And he said, I had to get out. I was furious. I was hurt. I thought, something's wrong. Something's not right with this.
So one night, Sabrina decided to creep into Frederick's computer room. And what she walked in on would send her entire world spinning out of control.
I felt betrayed. I felt hurt. I felt like I was sleeping with the enemy.
In the summer of 2002, Sabrina Brooks snuck into her husband Frederick's computer room and was shocked at what she saw.
Frederick was sitting in front of the monitor, and I noticed on the monitor there was a young female, and she was dancing. And I said, what are you looking at? And how old is she? Because she looked really young. He said, well, you know, you're out of commission because of your surgery, and I have to do what I have to do. I felt hurt, and I was mad. I was mad because what I saw on that screen was what I was thinking. He had been looking and chatting with different women.
Still healing from her surgery, Sabrina was in no condition for a blowout argument and decided to let it go for the time being.
I felt that I needed to concentrate on my health. I needed to get back to the old Sabrina because I knew something was going on.
I told her, right now you're not feeling good, and some men do stuff like that, So I said, just calm down, because the surgery had her on pins and needles and emotional anyway.
But the humiliation ate away at her.
As months passed, I could not understand his behavior. I couldn't understand why this man that I thought I knew so well was changing. He was getting to act like he didn't even care, like I wasn't important anymore.
So one morning in May 2003, after Frederick left for work, Sabrina decided to see what else her husband was up to.
I got on the computer and I typed in his password, and it said wrong password. And at that time it prompted me. It said, would you like to change the password? And I changed the password.
When his emails finally loaded, Sabrina was overcome by a wave of nausea.
I noticed a lot of different emails, but one particular screen name stood out because there was a lot of emails and they were recent. One said, I cannot meet you on Thursday because I have to be at school. I can't miss any more school. I was thinking she's a college student, and I was very angry. This explained why he was acting strange. I knew there was another woman and he was having an affair. I felt like I was sleeping with the enemy. I felt like I was sleeping with someone that I didn't know.
When Frederick called her later that morning, she couldn't contain her anger or her discovery.
He said, what's wrong? I said, I'm in your email account and I'm reading your mail and I need to know who this person is. And when I looked again, he had sent out an email to this person and told them, if someone contacts you, don't talk to him. It's my ex-girlfriend and she's crazy. I added this person's name to my instant messenger. And when she logged on, I started talking to her and she told me that you're his crazy ex-girlfriend. And I said, no, I'm actually his wife.
While defensive at first, the student finally began answering Sabrina's questions.
So I am typing, have you met him? And I said, where'd you meet him? And she said, he picked me up from school. And she described my place. And then she told me he took her to a hotel.
But before Sabrina could wrap her head around the betrayal, the girl would reveal that Frederick wasn't just a liar and a cheater. He was something much worse.
It was just so unbelievable.
We take an oath to do the right thing. He's hurting people.
It hurt me so bad that he would do that. He didn't seem like that type of person.
Sabrina Brooks was appalled at her husband Frederick's obvious lies as she continued her line of questioning online with his mistress.
I'm thinking she's probably a college student. And she named off the school, and it was high school. I asked, how old are you? And she says, I got sick to my stomach. She said when they got to the hotel, he forced himself on her. And I asked her, have you talked to anyone? Have you told anyone this? And she says, no, I'm scared. And I told her, I said, you've been violated. I got out of my computer chair and I cried from the depths of in here somewhere.
If Frederick was truly an internet predator, Sabrina knew she needed to act fast.
He knew I was talking to this girl. And he came home early that day. I told him, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. I packed up what I could and I moved in with my sister. And I said, you know, I have to do something. I have to say something. And I called her mom. I spoke with her mother.
She urged the woman to call the police, and they quickly interviewed both the victim and Sabrina.
When I spoke to the victim, she informed me that she had developed a relationship with a gentleman in a chat room. He suggested that they meet. So she told him he could come by the school and pick her up. They drove to the hotel. They had sexual contact with each other. They left the hotel room and drove by his residence. Then he had dropped her off back at the school. Then Sabrina provided me with a lot of information. All the information led me to Frederick Brooks.
And after confiscating Frederick's computers, police had all the evidence they needed.
He had approximately 94 contacts between the victim and himself. Also, there was pornography, and there were pictures of young women.
On July 24th, 2003, Frederick Brooks was arrested in uniform at his own department for sexual assault of a child.
It hurt me so bad that he would do that because he didn't seem like that type of person. And I had him around my nieces. Could have been one of them, you know. He could have did that to one of them. And I felt so bad for this young girl.
I went from seeing Frederick as a role model to seeing him as a monster. It was shocking that someone in uniform would do something like this.
I couldn't find any criminal history on Frederick. He was an outstanding employee. From my experience of being in law enforcement, I rarely see this. It's very serious to be in that position and then betray public trust.
And it wasn't long before he was linked to another incident in which he'd groomed a 15-year-old girl online.
No other women have come forward, but sometimes this behavior can go on for long periods of time without knowing because the victims are afraid to come forward.
On November 5th, 2004, Frederick G. Brooks was officially charged with 2 counts of sexual assault of a child. He pled guilty to avoid a trial. Looking back, Sabrina can't help but view her entire marriage to Frederick with new eyes.
I remember all the times that Frederick was on the computer. He was out there preying on little girls who were online. And I remember in Oklahoma, this young girl getting inside his truck. I wonder now, was she another victim?
5 days later, Frederick Brooks was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
I feel like I played a major part in getting him off the streets, and I also feel like there's probably a lot of other girls that are saved because of that. If I had to do it all over again, I'd do it the same way.
Today, Sabrina is not sure what motivated Frederick to go from protector to predator.
I believe that the protector part was basically a lure. To commit those type of crimes, something has to be seriously wrong. I don't know what.
I'm very proud of Sabrina. She's endured a lot of things that most people wouldn't have been able to endure. but she's strong. She's made it through.
But Sabrina still can't believe how Frederick was able to dupe so many.
Even the agency that he worked for didn't believe it. But it's easy to be fooled. And for a long time, I felt like I'm not going to ever trust again. But God has a way of carrying us through.
Growing up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 18-year-old Lisa Yarbrough was raised with good manners and a strong faith in God.
I actually prayed when I was a young teenager that I didn't want a lot of boyfriends. I wanted the one that I was supposed to meet and marry, and that was it.
And one fall evening in 1991, while on a walk with a friend, it seemed Lisa's prayers were answered.
This guy on a bike races by and goes, "Hi, ladies," and startled us. So we just kind of giggled at ourselves. The guy comes back and he's like, "I didn't mean to startle you ladies. I'm Dennis Bradford."
Lisa was instantly taken with the 23-year-old's good looks and Southern charm.
He was very handsome. Just by the way he said, "I apologize, ladies," really caught my attention immediately because he was a gentleman.
The girls invited him to a local hangout. And over drinks, Dennis told Lisa he had recently moved from Texas and was studying to become a stonemason.
We got along great. We talked about things that we like to do. I grew up on a farm, so I'd tell him about the slow country life, and he would tell me about life in the big city. He was just so fun to be around. I wanted to get to know him better.
And it wouldn't take long. Soon, Lisa and Dennis were spending every day together. And Lisa quickly realized Dennis just might be the one.
I liked his personality. He always had a smile on his face. So I knew right away that we really clicked.
So when Dennis proposed in the winter of 1992, Lisa didn't hesitate to say yes. 1 month later, she and Dennis made it official.
You know, we did have very limited funding, so my cousin did all of the dresses. The flower arrangements were flowers that we picked off the side of the road on the way to the church. It was a nice little country wedding, and we were happy.
Eager to start their new lives together, the young newlyweds moved from the big city onto a 400-acre farm in Bonnerdale, Arkansas, owned by Lisa's grandmother.
She had a big farmhouse up on the hill, and we had a trailer next door to her house. Dennis would help out with the chores around the farm. Get the tractor started up and get the cows up, mend fence, all that kind of stuff. Working on a farm is really hard work.
Dennis seemed to enjoy country living, and later that year, the couple was thrilled to welcome a son into their world.
I was extremely excited. I always wanted children. Dennis seemed to be very happy about having a family.
But Lisa started to notice a change in Dennis. A marked departure from his usual wide-as-a-country-mile smile.
I could tell as time went on that the country life maybe didn't suit him. I was seeing a depression come out. He would become just so quiet and reflective. I kind of felt like it was just a culture shock for him, and he was adjusting.
But the following year, Lisa gave birth to a daughter and noticed that when Dennis was with his children, his lighthearted nature returned. He became an active and doting dad.
I knew my dad as a fun, loving, kind, gentle person. I remember he would read to me. He would tell me stories. He'd just immediately make me laugh.
But what should have been an idyllic time was tainted by Dennis's unpredictable mood swings.
One night, we were just wrestling around playing, and I got him pinned down, and We're laughing, and he's smiling up at me, and he said, "I just wish I was dead." And he pushed me away from him and got up, walked out of the house. I was so angry because I knew a lot of people that would give anything to have the life that he had.
But Dennis returned 15 minutes later with a full apology.
He was just like, "I don't know where that came from." So it was a bad moment.
Although Dennis had his moments, they were few and far between.
For the most part, there were no bumps in the road. We got along great. I felt like he was my best friend.
And Dennis could always make Lisa laugh with his stories. But one afternoon, Dennis went a little too far with one of his tall tales.
He's kind of leaned up against a fence post with a smile on his face. And he said, "You know that little girl that they talk about on TV? You know that girl that got kidnapped?" And he said, "I did it." And I was like, "You did nothing of the sort. Why are you trying to get a rise out of me right now?" He's kind of like, "Yeah, that was a bad joke," and kind of like left it at that.
Bad jokes aside, Lisa started to notice that things with Dennis were a little more off than ever. And it wasn't just his stories.
He would have these quiet, reflective times, and then they would end up with him, leaving and going out to drink and not even telling me where he was going. And then I wouldn't see him till 6 o'clock the next morning. I would just sit and worry.
Though Dennis was a loving father, Lisa could tell that her once perfect marriage was coming to an end.
I would tell him our relationship can't continue like this. Something's got to change. We had started talking about going our separate ways, but maintaining a friendship so that, we could raise our kids together. I didn't want them not having a relationship with their dad.
So in the fall of 1994, after 2 years of marriage, Lisa and Dennis moved their family back to Hot Springs and decided to separate, but continued to live under one roof for the sake of their children.
I felt like I was just in my life and he was in his life. I was very disappointed. But I had to remind myself that I deserve to be happy.
Lisa decided it was time to focus on what she wanted in life.
Me, my friend, and my sister decided that we were going to go and have a few drinks and play pool and just have a good time, girls' night out.
But when Lisa came home, she saw a strange side to Dennis.
All the lights were off. It was completely dark, and flipped on the light, and he's sitting in a chair right across from the doorway. And he just had this blank look on his face. And he's like, "Where have you been?" I was like, "You have no right to be mad at me whatsoever." And then he got to where he was laughing, he's smiling, he's like, "You're right, I don't know what I was even thinking, getting mad, He's like, I guess I see how it feels,
And Dennis still pulled the occasional all-nighter. But on April 16th, 1996, he didn't return until 10 a.m., the longest he'd ever stayed out.
It was concerning, but at the same time, I'm just like, I'm not going to let this ruin my day. Had the kids out in the yard, we're playing. It's a beautiful day.
But Lisa's beautiful day was about to come to an abrupt end.
This car pulls up, and these two ladies get out of the car, and they're like, "Here's your husband, Dennis Bradford." I was like, "Yeah, Dennis is my husband."
And then one of the women delivered a shocking blow.
She said, "We're undercover detectives. Your husband raped a woman last night." And it felt like somebody had just kicked me in my chest. I was shocked. Dennis is such a good-looking, charming guy. Why would he have to force anyone? It didn't fit at all.
Eager to cooperate, Lisa led the detectives inside and woke up Dennis.
He got up and They snap a picture of him with a Polaroid camera and just say, well, you'll hear from us, and walk out the door.
Dennis insisted it must be a mistake.
And he's like, you know me better than that. I would never hurt anybody.
When 2 weeks passed without word from the detectives, Lisa started to give Dennis the benefit of the doubt.
He swore to me. Didn't happen. I was like, okay, I'll believe that it didn't happen.
Lisa clung to the hope that the police had been wrong. But soon, this tall tale would come back to haunt Lisa and her family in the most earth-shattering way.
I moved the curtain aside, and there's police cars as far as I can see.
I started screaming, "You can't take my dad, you can't take my dad."
I wanted it to just wake up from the bad dream that I seemed to be in.
In the spring of 1996, 2 weeks had passed since Lisa Bradford's life was turned upside down. Her husband Dennis stood accused of kidnapping and raping a woman in their small Arkansas town, which he firmly denied.
I didn't think that he was completely innocent, but what he was being accused of did not match the person that I knew him to be.
Then on May 1st, 1996, Lisa's quiet morning was interrupted by a loud banging on the door.
I reached over and I moved the curtain aside, and there's police cars as far as I can see.
Lisa and her 2 young children watched in horror as their father was hauled away in handcuffs.
I followed him out the front door and started screaming, "You can't take my dad, you can't take my dad." I didn't know what was going on. I just thought, this is the last time I'm ever going to get to see my dad.
Dennis was formally charged with kidnapping and rape, swabbed for DNA, and locked up in jail pending trial. After a long roller coaster ride, Lisa knew her marriage was finally over.
I was very upset. I was very hurt. I couldn't, in any way, comprehend that he did these things to her.
But when Dennis's trial began on January 22nd, 1997, the victim refused to have a rape kit administered, and the rape charges were dropped. But the kidnapping charges remained.
Why wouldn't she submit to being tested? It's not that I didn't believe her, but I didn't know what he had done. A huge part of me just wanted it to be over, to wake up from the bad dream that I seemed to be in.
Meanwhile, 500 miles away in a small Texas town, Jennifer Schuett had spent the last 7 years in her own bad dream. On August 10th, 1990, as 8-year-old Jennifer slept peacefully in her bed, a man slid open her window and lifted her out.
I thought I was dreaming. And I came to and opened my eyes, and he was staring at me. I tried to scream, but he immediately covered my nose and mouth and put me in his car. He's telling me he was an undercover cop, that I just needed to be quiet.
But when the man pulled over several miles from her home next to an open field, Jennifer instantly knew something was very wrong.
Immediately, he ripped my panties off of me.
The man brutally raped Jennifer. And to ensure her silence, he slit her throat and left her in the field to die.
I would try to scream, and I couldn't figure out why no sound would come out. I had just enough strength somehow to just throw my hand on my neck. And I felt this gaping wound. And I just knew at that point, I'm gonna die. I would go in and out of consciousness. And I could hear children playing off in the distance. And I just wanted to get help so badly. The help was right there. But I had no way to get anyone's attention because I couldn't even lift my head up. I didn't know that it was halfway cut off.
But miraculously, after 12 hours, children playing nearby found Jennifer, still alive. She was immediately transported to the hospital while police combed the field for evidence.
They located her clothing that she was wearing on that night she was abducted, along with a pair of men's underwear and a T-shirt. But back in 1990, there was no DNA testing done at the time.
Police spent years following leads that went nowhere. The monster that attacked her was never found. But Jennifer refused to give up the hunt.
It didn't matter to me how many years had passed. I didn't want to give up. I didn't want him to be able to hurt anybody else.
Back in Arkansas, Lisa Bradford was heartbroken. On January 28, 1997, her husband Dennis was convicted on the kidnapping charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison.
It was a very surreal experience, but I knew that I had to move on with my life. I was trying to be a strong parent for my kids.
Lisa landed a new job as a hotel desk clerk and even began dating. So she wasn't at all upset when Dennis made plans to marry a woman he wrote to from prison.
I had already had a boyfriend and moved into a place together. So that was okay, that he had established a relationship.
The couple filed for divorce, but Dennis was hoping to remain in his children's lives. And that happened sooner than anyone expected. 3 years later, Dennis was released from prison for good behavior.
I thought he was gone for 12 years. I was kind of surprised, but, okay with it too. I always wanted him to have that relationship with his children.
Dennis moved to Little Rock, and Lisa allowed him to visit with his children on a monthly basis.
It was just a different chapter in our lives. It did feel like all of the bad was behind us.
Until October 2009, when Lisa received a panicked phone call from her ex-father-in-law. And in a matter of seconds, Lisa's life would change forever.
He said, protect your children. Protect the children. It's all over the news.
There was a circus out in front of the police department. This made national media.
To be looking at someone that you have searched for years, it just felt so surreal.
On October 13th, 2009, Lisa Bradford received an unimaginable phone call from her ex-father-in-law.
He was very emotional, and he said, protect your children. Protect the children. It's all over the news. Dennis committed a horrific crime.
It seemed Dennis had been arrested again. This time for the kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder of an 8-year-old girl nearly 19 years prior, Jennifer Schuett.
It had been so long, it was like, well, this is almost unsolvable. We knew that they had done all the previous forensics that were available back in 1990, but I wanted to go in with fresh eyes.
So detectives submitted previously unprocessed DNA into CODIS, the National DNA Database. And in September 2009, they got a hit. Dennis Earl Bradford. DNA from his 1996 arrest had been linked to Jennifer's vicious attack.
It devastated me. Everything that I ever knew was just blown away. Anybody could be an evil monster.
I looked over to the TV. I was like, there goes that wonderful, fun, spectacular dad walking across the screen in handcuffs. It was a little unbelievable, like it was hard to grasp.
While Lisa and her children struggled with this new reality, Dennis was extradited to Dickinson, Texas, where Jennifer was waiting.
We put him into a room, a special room that had mirrors so that Jennifer could see him. So it was a pretty good feeling.
It just felt so surreal to be looking at someone that you have searched for years, like an arm's length away from you. I never cried. I just stared at him. That was like the best moment.
As Jennifer looked her attacker in the eye, 500 miles away, Lisa couldn't help but wonder if the story Dennis had told her that day on the farm was his way of confessing to her years ago.
I was saying to myself, why didn't I just play detective or something? Why didn't I question him? Why didn't I see that?
Suddenly, everything made sense. Dennis's depression, his newfound alcoholism.
It kind of clicked that it wasn't that he was missing his old life and stuff. He was ashamed of himself, trying to run away from it.
And in May of 2010, he finally succeeded. After confessing to the kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder of Jennifer Schuett, Dennis Bradford hanged himself to death in his jail cell. Today, Lisa thanks God every day that Jennifer Schuett lived to see her attacker in custody.
I'm in awe of her strength and for her to be able to tell her story. She's amazing.
I'm here to encourage other people to share their stories and to seek justice. That's what I'm alive for.
And Lisa has tried her best to show that strength in her own life, although it's been hard for her to trust others.
It's still hard. Imagining the person that I knew is also this person that committed this heinous crime. But at the same time, we just gotta keep moving forward.
It begins with a silence that feels too heavy for a small Texas town to carry. A silence that settles into the cracks of sidewalks and seeps beneath front porches. A silence that arrives long after the sirens have faded and the crime scene tape has been pulled away, because on a warm spring morning in 2001, someone vanished without leaving behind a scream, a struggle, or a goodbye, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the absence had already hardened into something far more terrifying than noise. In the early hours before sunrise, when the air still clings to the night and the town of Red Hollow, Texas, is suspended between sleep and routine, a single pickup truck sat parked crookedly near the edge of County Road 17, its driver's door slightly ajar, its engine cold, its radio silent, and its presence unexplained. No blood. No shattered glass. No skid marks. Just a vehicle that did not belong there, like an unanswered question abandoned on the shoulder of the road. By mid-morning, rumors began moving faster than facts. Someone said the truck belonged to a local woman who never missed work. Someone else said they'd seen headlights flicker in that area late the night before. Another swore they heard an argument carried by the wind. Each detail was thin on its own, but together they formed the first uneasy outline of what would soon become one of Texas's most unsettling cold cases. Her name was Laura Bennett. 34 years old. A lifelong resident of Red Hollow. A mother, a sister, a familiar face behind the counter at the same diner she'd worked at since high school. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Laura was not someone who simply disappeared. She had routines, habits, a life measured in predictable rhythms. She closed the diner every night. She called her mother every Sunday. She never left town without telling someone where she was going. And yet, on the night of April 12, 2001, she did not come home. When Laura's mother reported her missing later that afternoon, the words sounded unreal even as they were spoken aloud. Missing. The police dispatcher repeated the phrase, typing it into a system that had rarely needed to use it for someone like Laura Bennett. Red Hollow was the kind of place where crimes were small, personal, contained. A stolen lawnmower. A bar fight that ended in apologies. Not this. Not a woman vanishing into thin air. Deputies arrived at the abandoned truck within hours. They photographed it from every angle, dusted for prints, searched the surrounding fields with flashlights, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas began to scream. The smell of cut grass hung in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Nothing answered their questions. The keys were missing. Laura's purse was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading into the brush, no trail to follow. That absence became the first and most haunting feature of the case. No evidence meant no direction. And in Red Hollow, uncertainty spreads quickly. By nightfall, neighbors gathered on front lawns, whispering theories they would later deny having believed. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she met someone online. Maybe she owed money. Maybe she trusted the wrong person. Each guess chipped away at the comfort of familiarity, turning known faces into potential strangers. Detectives from the county sheriff's office took over the investigation within 24 hours. They canvassed the town methodically, knocking on doors, flipping through notebooks filled with names and alibis. Laura's co-workers described her last shift as ordinary. No strange customers. No heated arguments. She had joked about being tired and ready to go home. She had wiped down the counter, turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked out into the Texas night. After that, nothing. Her phone records offered no clarity. The last call was a brief check-in with her sister earlier that evening. Her bank accounts showed no unusual activity. Her social circle was small, stable, unremarkable. The more investigators learned about Laura Bennett, the less sense her disappearance made. And then there was the town itself. Red Hollow began to change. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone. Doors were locked earlier. Conversations lowered when patrol cars drove past. The idea that someone could vanish without explanation planted a fear that did not fade with daylight. Because if Laura Bennett could disappear, anyone could. Within weeks, the case slowed. Leads evaporated. Tips led nowhere. Search teams combed nearby woods, creeks, abandoned structures. They found old beer cans, animal bones, the debris of other people's forgotten moments, but no trace of Laura. Each failed search tightened the knot in the community's chest. By summer, the words missing person had begun to shift, hardening into something colder, heavier. Cold case. Investigators did not say it out loud, but the town felt it. The case files thickened while hope thinned. Posters faded in the sun. Candlelight vigils grew smaller. Life continued, because it always does, but something in Red Hollow had fractured quietly and permanently. Years passed. New deputies were hired. Old ones retired. Laura Bennett's name moved from active investigation to archived files, boxed and shelved in a records room that smelled of dust and paper, and unresolved questions. But the case never truly went away. It lingered in conversations, in sideways glances, in the way people remembered April of 2001 as a dividing line between before and after. What no one in Red Hollow could have known then was that the truth had not vanished with Laura. It had merely gone silent. Waiting. And when it finally resurfaced, 2 decades later, it would not come from a dramatic confession or a sudden discovery in the woods, but from a name so unexpected, so disturbingly familiar, that its revelation would send shockwaves through a town that thought it had already endured the worst. The Texas 2001 cold case was not finished. It was only beginning to breathe again. The problem with a disappearance is not just the absence of a body, but the way time begins to erode certainty, how memories soften at the edges, how facts blur into impressions, and impressions slowly mutate into beliefs, because in Red Hollow, as weeks turned into months, the case of Laura Bennett stopped being an emergency and started becoming a story people told themselves in order to sleep at night. Detectives kept working, at least on paper. They re-interviewed friends, co-workers, relatives. They mapped Laura's last known movements down to the minute, tracing her drive from the diner, the route she always took home, the stretch of County Road 17 where her truck was found abandoned like a discarded thought. They ran background checks on anyone who had crossed her path that week. Nothing cracked. No one broke. No one slipped. The diner became a focal point, not because anything unusual had happened there, but because it was the last place Laura had been seen alive. Regulars replayed that final night endlessly. Who sat at the counter? Who paid cash? Who lingered too long before leaving? A man who had tipped poorly. A woman who had asked too many questions. Ordinary moments were suddenly loaded with suspicion, as if the answer might reveal itself through repetition alone. Law enforcement followed the standard playbook. They checked known offenders in neighboring counties. They compared missing person reports across the state. They brought in cadaver dogs and walked them along the roadside, into the fields, through dry creek beds where the earth cracked underfoot. The dogs found nothing. Or worse, they found scents that went nowhere, false starts that raised hope only to crush it hours later. And then there were the tips. Hundreds of them. Calls from people who claimed to have seen Laura at gas stations, truck stops, grocery stores 3 towns over. Sightings that never lined up. Stories that dissolved under scrutiny. Each tip demanded time, manpower, belief. Each one ended the same way. Dead end. The lack of violence at the scene haunted investigators. No blood suggested she hadn't been attacked there. No signs of a struggle suggested she either left willingly or never had a chance to fight. That possibility split the investigation into 2 competing theories that would shadow the case for years. One side believed Laura had been abducted by someone she trusted, someone who convinced her to pull over, to step out of her truck, to follow without fear. The other believed something darker, faster, more opportunistic, a moment of wrong place, wrong time that left no witnesses behind. But both theories shared the same flaw. They required an invisible actor. Someone who moved through Red Hollow without leaving a footprint, someone who knew the roads, the rhythms, the people. Someone local. That realization changed the tone of the investigation. The question shifted from where Laura went to who among them could make her disappear. And in a town as small as Red Hollow, that question was poison. Neighbors began to look at one another differently. Old grudges resurfaced. Minor arguments were re-examined under the harsh light of suspicion. A former boyfriend, who had argued with Laura years earlier, found himself questioned again. A co-worker, who had once driven her home, was quietly watched. Even the man, who owned the land near where the truck was found, became a subject of whispered speculation. Nothing stuck. Everyone had an alibi. Everyone had a story. And none of them led to Laura Bennett. As months passed, pressure mounted on the sheriff's office. Laura's family pushed for answers that did not exist. The media arrived briefly, then left when the story stopped producing new headlines. Funding dried up. Resources shifted to cases with evidence, with victims, with outcomes. By the end of the first year, the investigation was officially downgraded. Not closed. Just quieted. The kind of quiet that feels like abandonment to those still listening. For Laura's mother, time became a cycle of waiting. Waiting for the phone to ring. Waiting for someone to knock on the door. Waiting for a knock that never came. Her bedroom remained untouched. Her clothes stayed in the closet. Every unanswered question hardened into a permanent ache. In the town, life resumed its surface normality. Football games. Church services. Barbecues. But Laura's name still hovered, unspoken but present, like a shadow no amount of sunlight could erase. Years rolled forward. Technology advanced. New databases emerged. DNA analysis improved. Cases once thought impossible began to reopen elsewhere. But Laura Bennett's file remained unchanged. No body. No suspect. No crime scene. Just a missing woman and a pickup truck left behind on a dark Texas road. And then, quietly, almost unnoticed, a single detail began to shift. In 2009, during a routine audit of old evidence, an investigator noticed something that had always been there but never fully examined. A partial print recovered from the exterior of Laura's truck. Too smudged to identify in 2001. Too incomplete to matter back then. But technology had changed. And so had the way cold cases were viewed. The print was sent for reanalysis. No expectations. No announcement. Just a form, a barcode, a transfer into a system far larger than Red Hollow. Weeks later, the result came back. Inconclusive. Not a match. But not meaningless either. It was enough to reopen a file that had been gathering dust for nearly a decade. Enough to remind investigators that the past was not as settled as it seemed. The Texas 2001 cold case stirred again, not with a bang, but with a quiet administrative decision that would eventually pull old names back into the light and expose a truth so close, so uncomfortable, that no one in Red Hollow would be able to pretend they hadn't known him all along. The waiting was not over. It had only learned how to be patient. When a cold case begins to stir, it does not announce itself with urgency or spectacle. It moves slowly, bureaucratically, carried forward by paperwork and quiet curiosity rather than sirens and breaking news. In Red Hollow, the renewed attention on Laura Bennett's disappearance arrived like a distant vibration, barely felt at first, a subtle shift in tone among the few investigators still willing to look backward instead of ahead. The sheriff at the time authorized a limited review. Not a full reopening. Not yet. Just a second look. The kind of cautious step taken when hope has learned to temper itself. Files were pulled from storage. Photographs yellowed at the edges were spread across tables once more. Statements were reread, this time with different eyes, shaped by years of hindsight and the uncomfortable knowledge that the first pass had failed. What stood out now were not the dramatic moments, but the ordinary ones. The people who had been interviewed once and then forgotten. The alibis that were accepted without challenge because they sounded reasonable, because they came from familiar faces, because nobody wanted to believe that the threat could have been so close. Laura's timeline was reconstructed again, minute by minute, but this time investigators paid attention to what was missing. The gaps. The moments no one had accounted for because they seemed too small to matter. The 10-minute window between leaving the diner and the estimated time her truck stopped moving. The stretch of road where cell service dropped out completely. The fact that no one could place Laura at any location after she left work, not even mistakenly. That absence pointed to intent. Someone had planned enough to ensure there would be no witnesses, no accidental sightings, no chance encounters. That realization shifted the tone of the case from misfortune to design. The list of persons of interest was quietly rebuilt. Names resurfaced that had once been scribbled in the margins of reports and then dismissed. A former customer, who had asked Laura personal questions. A man who had been seen near the diner too often without explanation. A local handyman who worked odd jobs and knew the back roads better than anyone. One name, however, kept reappearing, not because of anything overtly suspicious, but because of proximity. He lived less than a mile from where Laura's truck had been found. He passed through that stretch of County Road 17 almost nightly. He had spoken to deputies early on, offering help, offering observations, offering himself as a concerned neighbor. His name was Daniel Mercer. In 2001, Daniel Mercer was 42 years old. Married. Employed. Known around town as quiet, dependable, the kind of man people trusted with their spare keys and their dogs when they went out of town. He had been interviewed once, briefly, and released from consideration without fanfare. His alibi was simple. He said he had been home that night. Alone. Watching television. Nothing about him had triggered alarms. Now, years later, investigators saw him differently. Not as a suspect, but as an unanswered question. The kind that lingered because it had never been fully explored. They pulled his old statement and compared it to others given that same week. The language stood out. He had volunteered details no one had asked for. He had emphasized how much he admired Laura, how shocked he was by her disappearance, how dangerous the world could be for women alone at night. At the time, it sounded empathetic. Now, it sounded rehearsed. Still, suspicion was not evidence. And cold cases are littered with theories that feel compelling until they collapse under scrutiny. Investigators began quietly checking Daniel Mercer's history. Nothing criminal. No arrests. No reports. No visible cracks. He had lived in Red Hollow most of his life. He had attended Laura's candlelight vigil. He had shaken hands with her family. He had blended perfectly into the collective grief. And that was the problem. As detectives dug deeper, they noticed something else that had been overlooked in 2001. Daniel Mercer's routine. He worked late some nights. Early others. He drove routes that overlapped with Laura's commute. He owned a second vehicle that had never been mentioned during the initial investigation. An older model truck that he claimed rarely ran. Records showed it had been repaired 2 weeks after Laura disappeared. New tires. Engine work. Nothing illegal. Nothing definitive. But timing has a way of amplifying meaning. Investigators requested permission to speak with Daniel again. Informally. Just a follow-up. When they arrived at his house, they were struck by how little had changed. Same porch. Same lawn. Same measured politeness. Daniel welcomed them in without hesitation, offering coffee, answering questions calmly, confidently. He repeated his story almost word for word. Home. Alone. Television. He expressed sadness for Laura's family. He asked if there had been any progress. His voice never wavered. But when asked about his second truck, there was a pause. Barely perceptible. A fraction of a second too long. He explained it away easily. The truck was unreliable. He hardly used it. He couldn't remember exactly when it had been fixed. Time blurred after so many years, he said. The interview ended without confrontation. No accusations. No raised voices. Just a polite goodbye. As detectives sat in their car afterward, they said little. But both felt it. The sensation that comes when instinct brushes against possibility. Not certainty. Not proof. Just the uncomfortable sense that something had been missed. Still, the case could not move forward on feeling alone. They needed something tangible. Something that could bridge the gap between suspicion and action. They returned to the evidence. The partial print. The phone records. The truck. The roadside. They began mapping Daniel Mercer's movements using whatever fragments time had not erased. Employment records. Utility usage. Credit card statements. Patterns emerged slowly, reluctantly. What they found did not prove guilt. But it proved access, opportunity, familiarity. And in cold cases, opportunity is often the first door that opens. The town of Red Hollow remained unaware that one of its most trusted residents had quietly stepped back into the frame of a mystery that never truly left. While children rode bikes on familiar streets and neighbors waved across fences, the past was aligning itself with the present, preparing to reveal how close danger had always been. The Texas 2001 cold case was no longer asleep. It was watching. Once a familiar name re-enters a cold case, it changes the weight of every memory connected to it. Innocent gestures are replayed. Casual conversations are re-examined. In Red Hollow, the past did not rewrite itself overnight, but it began to feel unstable, as if the ground beneath decades of assumptions had quietly loosened. Investigators knew better than to rush. Cold cases punish impatience. They reward restraint, pattern recognition, the willingness to sit with ambiguity longer than comfort allows. Daniel Mercer was not a suspect yet. On paper, he was a footnote. In reality, he was becoming a focal point. The team expanded their scope outward, not inward. They looked at Daniel's circle. His routines. His movements across years, not days. Cold cases are rarely solved by what someone did once, but by what they did repeatedly without anyone noticing. They began with geography. County Road 17 was not random. It was a connector, a shortcut locals used to avoid traffic, a road that disappeared from maps once you stopped looking closely. Daniel used it often. He had mentioned it casually during his second interview, as if it were nothing more than a detail, a habit shared by many. But usage data from toll records and fuel purchases painted a clearer picture. He traveled that road more frequently than most, especially late at night. Then there were the gaps. Nights when Daniel's phone went silent for hours. No calls. No messages. No pings. In 2001, this would have meant nothing. In hindsight, it stood out like an intentional void. Investigators cross-referenced those gaps with other unsolved incidents in neighboring counties. Not disappearances. Not murders. Reports that never grew legs. A woman followed home, but never attacked. A car found unlocked, keys missing, nothing stolen. Moments that did not become crimes because something interrupted them. Or someone changed their mind. Patterns do not scream. They whisper. The team requested assistance from a regional cold case unit, bringing in analysts who had no emotional connection to Red Hollow. Fresh eyes. No loyalties. No history. They were given access to everything. The files. The interviews. The photographs. The rumors that had once been dismissed because they sounded too ugly to be true. One analyst fixated on Laura's final phone call. Not the content. The timing. The call ended just before she left the diner. After that, nothing. No texts. No missed calls. No panic. That suggested she never had time to reach for her phone again. Whatever happened was quick. Controlled. Another analyst focused on the truck. The way it was parked. Crooked, but not careless. As if someone else had driven it, someone unfamiliar with its handling. The fact that the door was left ajar suggested interruption. Or urgency. The more they looked, the more the pieces leaned toward a single uncomfortable conclusion. Laura had likely been intercepted. Not chased. Not ambushed violently. Stopped. Spoken to. Convinced. That required familiarity, trust, or the appearance of it. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer continued living his life uninterrupted. He attended church. He hosted barbecues. He aged into the role of a harmless fixture, a man whose presence reassured rather than threatened. He had no idea how closely his past was being dissected, how every benign detail was being weighed against the possibility that he had been hiding in plain sight. Investigators requested a search warrant. It was denied. Not enough evidence. Suspicion, even informed suspicion, does not cross the legal threshold. They needed something concrete. Something that connected Daniel Mercer to Laura Bennett beyond coincidence and proximity. That something arrived unexpectedly. In 2012, more than a decade after Laura vanished, a woman in a neighboring county reported a disturbing encounter. She claimed a man had followed her from a grocery store parking lot, blocked her car momentarily on a rural road, and attempted to speak to her through a cracked window. He left when she screamed. She reported the incident days later, uncertain whether it mattered. The description was vague. Middle-aged. Quiet demeanor. Local accent. But one detail stood out. The vehicle. An older truck. Recently repaired. The report was buried. Filed. Forgotten. Until an analyst revisiting cross-county incidents flagged it during a routine sweep. They ran the vehicle description against DMV records. The result was not definitive. But it was close enough to raise alarms. Daniel Mercer owned a truck matching that description at the time. Still, this was circumstantial. A shadow of a connection. Not a bridge. The break came not from new evidence, but from old evidence seen differently. Investigators returned to the partial print recovered from Laura's truck. They ran it again through updated databases. Broader this time. Less conservative. The result was not a match. But it was a near match. A statistical probability that suggested shared characteristics with a known individual. Someone whose prints were on file for reasons unrelated to crime. The name that surfaced stopped the room cold. Daniel Mercer. Not definitive. Not enough for an arrest. But enough to change everything. Enough to escalate. Enough to justify surveillance. From that moment on, Daniel was no longer just a familiar face in an old file. He was a man whose past was beginning to push back against the present. In Red Hollow, nothing appeared different. But beneath the routine, beneath the rituals of everyday life, the machinery of a long-dormant investigation was grinding back to life, inch by inch, drawing closer to a truth that would shatter the town's last illusion of safety. The cold case was no longer theoretical. It was narrowing. Surveillance changes the nature of a case. It shifts the balance from speculation to observation, from memory to movement, from what someone says to what they do when they believe no one is watching. When Daniel Mercer crossed that invisible line, he did not know it, but every step he took began to carry weight it never had before. Unmarked cars appeared quietly in Red Hollow. They did not linger. They blended. Parked where neighbors would not question them. Investigators worked in shifts, logging Daniel's routines with the discipline of people who understood that the smallest deviation could be the loudest confession. At first, there was nothing. Daniel's life unfolded exactly as it always had. Morning coffee. Short drives into town. Long afternoons at home. Occasional late-night errands that could be explained away as restlessness or habit. He did not meet anyone suspicious. He did not visit places that raised alarms. If anything, he seemed painfully ordinary. But cold cases do not resolve themselves quickly. They demand patience. As weeks passed, patterns began to form. Daniel favored certain roads at night. Always the same ones. Back roads. Secondary routes. Places where cell service dipped and street lights thinned. He drove them slowly, deliberately, as if retracing something rather than searching for something new. Investigators noted how often he passed the spot where Laura Bennett's truck had been found. Sometimes he slowed. Sometimes he did not. But the consistency was undeniable. Then there were the stops. Unscheduled. Unnecessary. Pulling over briefly, stepping out of his vehicle, standing in silence before getting back in and driving away. No phone calls. No visible purpose. Just presence. Psychologists consulted on the case offered cautious interpretations. Revisiting locations tied to unresolved acts. Compulsion. Control. Not proof. But context. Meanwhile, the legal team worked in parallel, building a framework strong enough to support what everyone feared but could not yet prove. They revisited Laura's financial records again, this time searching for transactions that might suggest coercion rather than choice. They found none. But they did find something else. In the weeks before her disappearance, Laura had withdrawn small amounts of cash more frequently than usual. Not enough to raise alarms. Enough to be noticed in retrospect. Investigators wondered if someone had been pressuring her. Or if she had sensed something approaching and did not know how to name it. They interviewed Laura's co-workers again. One of them hesitated this time. A pause that had not existed in 2001. She recalled a man who sometimes waited until the diner was nearly empty before approaching the counter. Quiet. Polite. Asked Laura questions about her schedule, her drive home, whether she felt safe working late. At the time, it seemed like concern. She did not know his name. But when shown a photo lineup, her finger stopped. Hovered. Then landed. Daniel Mercer. It was not a definitive identification. Memory degrades. Suggestibility creeps in. But it was enough to add pressure to a case already straining against its own age. Investigators requested another interview. This time, Daniel declined. Politely. Legally. He said he had already answered their questions years ago, and did not see the need to repeat himself. His tone was calm. But the refusal marked a shift. Cooperation had ended. From that moment on, everything accelerated. A warrant was granted for a limited search of Daniel's vehicles. Nothing obvious surfaced. No weapons. No personal belongings linked to Laura. But forensic testing revealed traces of soil in the bed of his older truck that matched the mineral composition of an area miles from Red Hollow, a place never searched because it had never been connected to the case. Investigators returned to that location. Dense brush. Uneven terrain. Private land that had changed ownership twice since 2001. They searched carefully, methodically. They found disturbed earth. Old. Reclaimed by time. Too degraded to yield remains. But not untouched. The discovery was enough to shift the case from missing person to presumed homicide. It was also enough to fracture the town's quiet denial. Rumors ignited. Someone had seen police tape. Someone had heard Daniel was being watched. Someone claimed they had always suspected him. Others pushed back, angry at the implication, defensive of the man they had trusted for decades. Daniel's wife left town abruptly. No statement. No explanation. Her departure spoke louder than anything she could have said. Under mounting pressure, investigators made a calculated decision. They brought Daniel in, not for Laura, but for questioning related to the more recent incident in the neighboring county. A tactical move. A way to open a door that had been closed for too long. Daniel arrived composed. Older now. Slower. But still careful. He answered questions narrowly. He denied everything. He dismissed the encounter as a misunderstanding. A coincidence. A stranger mistaking him for someone else. Then they changed tactics. They showed him photographs. Not of Laura. Of the road. The truck. The diner. Places he had passed countless times without consequence. They watched his face. The micro-expressions. The flickers of recognition he could not fully suppress. When they finally said Laura Bennett's name, the room tightened. Daniel did not react the way innocent people do. He did not express shock. Or outrage. Or grief. He leaned back slightly. Crossed his arms. Exhaled. As if bracing for something long overdue. He said nothing. Hours passed. Silence stretched. Interrogators rotated. The strategy was simple. Let the weight of 20 years settle. Let the truth press outward from the cracks time had failed to seal. Near the end of the night, Daniel spoke. Not a confession. Not yet. He asked a question instead. Do you know how long it's been? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time since 2001, the possibility of answers felt real. Not guaranteed. Not complete. But close enough to touch. Outside the interrogation room, Red Hollow slept uneasily, unaware that the man they had waved to for years was sitting under fluorescent lights, confronting a past that refused to stay buried. The Texas cold case was no longer cold. It was burning its way back to the surface. Time behaves differently inside an interrogation room. It stretches, folds, loses meaning, especially when the person sitting under the lights has spent years rehearsing silence. Daniel Mercer's question was not accidental. It was a test. A way to measure how much the past had survived without him. How long since what? An investigator asked, careful, neutral. Daniel did not answer immediately. He stared at the tabletop, tracing an invisible line with his fingertip, the gesture of a man who had repeated this moment in his mind more times than he could count. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost conversational. Since it stopped mattering, he said. The words landed softly and detonated anyway. Interrogators did not push. They let the silence do the work. Silence is unforgiving. It leaves no place to hide once someone starts filling it with meaning. Daniel talked around the edges. He spoke about the town. About how things used to be. About how people pretend they want the truth until it arrives wearing a familiar face. He complained about being watched, about the way suspicion corrodes trust. He did not deny knowing Laura. He admitted he had spoken to her. He framed it as concern. Neighborly interest. Nothing more. But something had shifted. The wall he had maintained for 2 decades was no longer seamless. Cracks showed. When investigators pressed him on the night Laura disappeared, Daniel repeated his alibi. Home. Alone. Television. But this time, The words sounded tired. Less convincing. As if he knew they were being spoken into a room that no longer believed them. They introduced the soil analysis. The partial print. The co-worker's recollection. Not as accusations. As facts. As pieces of a story he no longer controlled. Daniel's breathing changed. Shallow. Measured. He asked for water. He asked for a break. Both were granted. When he returned, he did not sit the same way. He leaned forward now. Engaged. The posture of a man negotiating, not defending. "You don't have her," he said quietly. It was not a question. Investigators did not respond. They did not need to. The statement spoke for itself. Knowledge without context. Certainty without confirmation. They asked him how he knew that. Daniel smiled. Just slightly. The kind of smile that reveals nothing and everything at once. The interview ended without a confession. But it ended with something just as valuable. Cause. Prosecutors were briefed overnight. The decision was not simple. There was still no body. No direct physical evidence tying Daniel to Laura's disappearance beyond probability and pattern. But the case had momentum now, and momentum has a way of turning pressure into mistakes. Daniel Mercer was released pending further investigation. Not because he was cleared, but because holding him without charges would give him exactly what he wanted. Time to adapt. Time to retreat. Time to disappear. Instead, investigators watched closely. Daniel returned home under a cloud he could not shake. Neighbors noticed the unmarked cars. Whispers hardened into certainty. Doors closed more quickly when he walked by. The town's affection curdled into something sharp and accusatory. Within days, Daniel made a move. He began cleaning. Not ordinary cleaning. Methodical. Deep. He rented a dumpster. Emptied his garage. Disposed of boxes he claimed held nothing of value. Investigators documented everything. Photographed every item. Catalogued what was thrown away and what was not. Among the discarded items was an old cooler. Sun-bleached. Cracked at the corners. It tested positive for traces of blood. Degraded. Inconclusive. Human. Possibly female. Possibly not. Enough to justify escalation. A search warrant followed. This time, it was granted. They tore through Daniel's property with precision. Floors. Walls. Crawl spaces. Nothing obvious surfaced. No trophies. No remains. No definitive link to Laura Bennett. But absence, again, became a presence. In a locked cabinet, investigators found a notebook. Old. Leather-bound. Inside were dates. Locations. Short phrases. No names. No explanations. But one date was circled heavily. April 12, 2001. That date erased the last argument for coincidence. Daniel was arrested that afternoon. Not for murder. Not yet. For obstruction. For evidence tampering. Charges that could hold him while the larger truth was pursued. The news hit Red hollow like a physical blow. The man they had trusted. The man who had comforted Laura's family. The man who had stood at her vigil holding a candle. Shock turned to anger. Anger turned to shame. People replayed every interaction, they had ever had with Daniel Mercer, searching for signs they should have seen. Signs that had been invisible because they were never meant to be seen. In custody, Daniel changed again. He stopped speaking entirely. He requested a lawyer. He stared through interviews without engaging. He waited. And waiting, investigators realized, had always been his strength. As the legal process churned forward, pressure mounted from another direction. Laura's family demanded answers. The public demanded accountability. The media circled, eager to frame the story as closure. But closure remained elusive. Because Daniel Mercer still had not said what happened to Laura Bennett. And without her, without a body, without a final location, the case hovered on the edge between justice and collapse. Behind bars, Daniel watched the days pass, unmoved by the chaos he had unleashed. He had carried this secret for 20 years. He could carry it longer. Unless something broke him. And something was about to. Pressure does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in through paperwork, through court calendars and procedural deadlines, through the slow realization that time, once an ally, has begun to work against you. For Daniel Mercer, the walls were no longer just concrete and steel. They were made of anticipation, of unanswered questions multiplying beyond his control. Prosecutors knew the danger. Without a body, without a confession, the case could fracture under its own weight. Circumstantial evidence persuades, but it does not always convict. They needed leverage. Something Daniel could not ignore. Something he had not planned for. That leverage arrived from the past, wearing a different name. In a quiet county office 300 miles away, an analyst reviewing old assault reports noticed a familiar pattern. Late-night encounters. Rural roads. A man initiating conversation, under the guise of concern. Women who escaped not because the threat vanished, but because something interrupted it. One report, filed in 2003, included a detail that had never been cross-referenced before. The man's voice. Calm. Local. Familiar. The survivor had described it as unsettlingly reassuring. Investigators reached out. Carefully. Respectfully. Trauma does not fade on command. The woman hesitated at first. Years had passed. She had built a life around forgetting. But when she was shown a photograph, her response was immediate. Her hands shook. Her breathing shortened. She did not need time to think. That's him, she said. The identification was not perfect. Memory never is. But it was powerful. Powerful enough to change the shape of the case. Powerful enough to reopen wounds that had never healed. Daniel Mercer was transferred to a different facility. A tactical move. New environment. New routines. Isolation from the familiarity that had always grounded him. Interrogators returned, this time with a different approach. They did not accuse. They did not demand. They spoke about patterns. About escalation. About how control slips when silence stretches too long. Daniel listened. He said nothing. Then they introduced the witness. Not in person. Through words. Through the description of fear. Through the recounting of a night that almost ended the same way Laura's had. Daniel's composure faltered for the first time. His jaw tightened. His eyes fixed on a point just beyond the room, as if watching a memory replay itself against his will. You didn't plan for her to get away, an investigator said quietly. Daniel closed his eyes. That was all it took. Not a confession. Not yet. but an acknowledgement that something had nearly slipped once before. Days passed. Then weeks. The legal machinery moved forward relentlessly. Court dates loomed. Charges stacked. Media narratives hardened into certainty. Daniel's lawyer advised silence. The safest path. The path of endurance. But endurance has limits. The break came unexpectedly, from a place no one anticipated. Laura Bennett's mother passed away quietly in her sleep, 22 years after filing a missing person report that never closed. The news reached Daniel within hours. Someone wanted him to know. Someone wanted him to feel the weight of a life spent waiting. That night, Daniel asked to speak. No lawyer. No conditions. Just a conversation. The room felt different this time. Smaller. Tighter. Daniel's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. I didn't mean for it to last this long, he said. Investigators did not interrupt. They let the words find their own momentum. He talked about loneliness. About obsession disguised as concern. About how easy it was to insert himself into Laura's routine without her realizing the cost. He described pulling alongside her truck that night, flashing his headlights, signaling that something was wrong. A loose taillight. A safety issue. A lie designed to sound helpful. She trusted him. That was the hardest part to hear. Daniel's story slowed as he approached the point of no return. His hands trembled. His breathing shallow again. He did not use the word kill. He spoke around it. An accident. A panic. A moment that spun out of control. He admitted to moving her. To driving. To choosing a place no one would think to search. But when pressed for the location, he stopped. The wall returned. I can't, he said. Not yet. It was enough to charge him. Enough to anchor the case in admission rather than inference. But it was not enough to bring Laura home. Outside the facility, news broke in fragments. Confession. Arrest. Shocking details withheld. Red Hollow reeled. Vindication collided with grief. Relief tangled with rage. For investigators, the work was unfinished. A confession without a body is a promise half kept. They needed the final piece. The one Daniel still held. And Daniel knew it. He had waited 22 years to speak. He could wait a little longer. Unless something forced his hand. Daniel Mercer's refusal wasn't anger, it wasn't panic, it was control returning to his hands like a familiar weapon, because a confession is not the same as surrender, and in the space between, I did it and here is where she is, he still owned the only thing that mattered. He could see it in the way the detectives' posture shifted, the way their pens stopped moving for a second, the way the room tightened around a missing coordinate. A single location that could turn an admission into a recovery, a theory into a grave, a headline into a homecoming. He had given them enough to haunt the town, enough to shame it, enough to make sure nobody would ever wave at him again across a fence, but he had not given them Laura, and without Laura, he could still dictate the pace of everyone else's grief. They moved him back to his cell and the corridor smelled like bleach and old metal, the kind of sterile cleanliness that never reaches the parts of a building where secrets settle. Red Hollow was already screaming in whispers by the time the sun came up, and the phones at the sheriff's office would not stop ringing, and people who had never said Laura Bennett's name out loud in years were suddenly saying it like prayer, like apology, like a desperate attempt to turn time backward. But investigators stayed focused on the one brutal truth: Daniel Mercer had spoken, and that meant he could be made to speak again. The next interview was not interrogation. It was negotiation. No shouting. No threats. Just a table, a recorder, and the unbearable patience of people who understood that a man like Daniel doesn't respond to rage, he responds to leverage. They slid a paper across the table, a draft deal, the kind that makes your stomach turn even when you've been in law enforcement long enough to know it happens every day. Reduced charges, plea recommendation, protections, concessions that would enrage the public if they ever saw the fine print. Not because Daniel deserved mercy, but because Laura deserved to be found. Daniel scanned the paper slowly, like he was reading a menu. He did not look surprised. He looked entertained. "You think this is about time," he said, voice low, dry. "You think I'm afraid of dying in here." He tapped the table lightly with one finger, rhythmic, deliberate. "I'm afraid of being ordinary," he continued. "That's what you don't get. Ordinary is the punishment." He pushed the paper back. The message was clear. He wanted something bigger than a plea. He wanted a story that would outlive him. He wanted to be the center of the final chapter. Outside, the media began circling like vultures that could smell a corpse they hadn't yet seen. Headlines wrote themselves in real time: Texas 2001 cold case cracked. Unexpected suspect. Hometown shocked. The town tried to digest the impossible fact that the monster had been at church, at block parties, at candlelight vigils, holding a flame while hiding the match. People screamed at each other in parking lots, accused each other of ignoring signs, of dismissing Laura, of choosing comfort over suspicion. The diner where she last worked became a pilgrimage site for cameras. Her co-workers were asked to cry on cue. Her sister learned what it felt like to watch your grief become content. But none of that mattered to the ground teams assembling quietly at dawn, because investigators were building a search based on what Daniel had already let slip. Not the location, not the map point, but the shape of his words. He had mentioned driving. He had described a place no one would think to search. He had said it was chosen in panic, meaning he didn't travel far, meaning it was close enough to reach quickly, meaning it was somewhere he knew intimately, somewhere he had visited before, somewhere he didn't need directions to find. They took his notebook again, the leather-bound one with dates and terse phrases like bruises on paper. They laid every entry out in chronological order and looked for patterns, weekends, nights, weather. Analysts flagged sequences that corresponded to his late-night drives, the roads he favored, the stops that had seemed purposeless. A cluster of dates formed a shadow around a specific region of land northeast of Red Hollow, where property lines were messy and ownership had changed hands like secrets being passed along. The soil trace from his truck already pointed in that direction. Now they pulled historical satellite imagery, grainy and imperfect, and compared it to present-day maps. They looked for disturbed patches, for clearings that appeared briefly and then vanished under vegetation, for access routes that existed in 2001 and were now swallowed by brush. They pulled old hunting permits, old land use records, anything that could explain why Daniel would know that area. They found something small and sickeningly mundane. He had volunteered years earlier with a local cleanup crew to remove trash and debris from an abandoned gravel pit on private land. The kind of civic work that wins handshakes and compliments. The kind of work that gives you knowledge without suspicion. The gravel pit sat like a wound in the landscape, half reclaimed by weeds, its edges crumbling, its depths shadowed even at noon. It was not on any tourist map. It was not a place families visited. It was a place teenagers drove to for beer and dares, a place hunters used as a shortcut, a place people avoided because it felt wrong without being able to explain why. If Daniel wanted a place no one would think to search, this was the kind of place that fit. Search teams arrived in staggered waves. They moved with the careful intensity of people who know cameras will follow if they move too fast. They used ground-penetrating radar, dogs trained to find what time tries to erase, metal probes pushed into earth inch by inch. The air smelled of dust and old clay. The pit itself held pockets of stagnant water, black and still, reflecting nothing but sky. The first day yielded nothing. The second day yielded less than nothing, false alerts, confusing readings, the kind that eats at your nerve endings because it makes you wonder whether you're walking circles around the truth. Deputies worked 12-hour shifts under a sun that seemed indifferent. Laura's family stood behind a perimeter line, watching strangers dig into the earth like surgeons searching for a heartbeat that has been gone too long. Nobody spoke. People cried without sound. On the third day, a dog hit hard near the eastern slope where scrub brush grew thick and tangled, where the ground dipped slightly, as if it had once been cut away, and then filled again. The handler froze. The dog circled, nose down, insistent. Investigators knelt and smelled the soil, that ancient human instinct of trying to sense death with your own body. They marked the spot. They brought in the radar. The scan showed an anomaly, a void, irregular, about 6 feet down. Not a natural pocket. Something placed. Something covered. They began digging by hand. Shovels were too violent for this kind of moment. Picks were too loud. They used trowels and brushes, clearing earth gently, almost respectfully, even though the person who put it there had shown no respect at all. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt. Clay clung to gloves. Sweat soaked into uniforms. Time slowed to the pace of breath. 4 feet down, they found fabric. A strip, decayed, colorless, but undeniably human-made. Then a button. Then another. The pit held its secret stubbornly, like it had been trained to do so. They stopped and called in forensic specialists. Photos were taken. Measurements recorded. Every movement became deliberate. The world narrowed to a hole in the ground, to the soft scrape of a brush, to the sound of someone swallowing hard behind you. When bone finally appeared, pale against the dark soil, the entire site seemed to exhale. Not relief. Not closure. A different kind of weight. The weight of confirmation. The remains were incomplete, degraded, but present. Enough to change everything. Word reached the jail that night, because news always travels faster than dignity. Daniel Mercer sat in his cell, listening to footsteps in the corridor, and for the first time since he had been arrested, he looked unsettled. Not frightened. Not guilty. Unsettled, like a man who has kept a door closed for so long that he forgot what it would sound like when someone finally opened it from the other side. They brought him in again. This time, the interview room did not feel like negotiation. It felt like a verdict taking shape. "We found her," an investigator said quietly. Daniel stared, waiting for the trick. "We found remains," the investigator corrected, "because words matter in rooms like this. We are working to confirm identity." Daniel's face tightened. His eyes flicked away. He swallowed. The power he had held, the location, was gone now, ripped from his hands by the one thing he could never truly control, persistence. He had tried to make them beg for it. They had taken it anyway. He leaned forward, voice low, urgent, the calm slipping now. "You don't understand what you're doing." The investigator did not blink. "We are bringing her home." Daniel shook his head slowly, and there it was, the first glimpse of something like fear, not fear of prison, but fear of exposure, fear that the private story he had curated would become public in a way he could not shape. "You'll tear the town apart," he muttered. "It's already torn," the investigator said. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one was not control. It was loss. Over the next hours, with the location no longer his bargaining chip, Daniel began to talk in a different way. Not to confess more, not to cleanly narrate what happened, but to reframe it, to soften it, to reshape himself into something less monstrous in the record. He described Laura as kind, trusting, too good for the world, words that sounded like tribute until you realized they were theft, stealing even her character to decorate his own story. He insisted he never meant to harm her. He insisted she had panicked. He insisted it was an accident, the word repeated like a charm against the unbearable. Investigators listened, not because they believed him, but because every sentence could contain a detail that mattered. A weapon. A time. A sequence. A second location. Something still hidden. And then, without warning, he slipped. He mentioned a smell. Gasoline and damp earth. He mentioned a tool. A rope. He mentioned the moment he realized she was quiet. Not screaming. Not begging. Quiet. The room chilled. That was not accident. That was aftermath. They pressed. Daniel's voice sharpened, defensive again. He demanded his lawyer. He demanded the recorder be turned off. He demanded control that had already left him. But it was too late. The town was already changing shape around the newly opened grave. The headlines would shift from missing to found. From mystery to horror. And in Red Hollow, people would soon have to face the worst kind of truth, that evil did not come from outside, it lived among them, smiled at them, waved at them, and waited for the right night to pull someone off the road with a lie that sounded like concern. The search site stayed lit through the night, floodlights bleaching the ground pale as day, because the work was not finished. There could be more evidence. More remains. More truth buried deeper than bone. And every shovel of dirt carried the same question, heavy and relentless, the question that had haunted Red Hollow for 22 years and now returned sharper than ever, because finding Laura was not the end, it was the beginning of something worse. Why, and how, and what else Daniel Mercer had done while everyone was watching the wrong horizon. And somewhere in the town, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, people were realizing that the most terrifying part of the Texas 2001 cold case wasn't the disappearance. It was the familiarity of the man now trying, desperately, to control the story even as the earth itself refused to keep his secret any longer. The floodlights at the gravel pit made the night feel artificial, like a movie set built for a scene nobody wanted to watch, but the air was real, the fatigue was real, the silence was real, and every pair of eyes fixed on the ground carried the same thought without daring to say it. This is where the story stopped being a question and became a fact. The forensic team worked with the careful, almost reverent brutality of procedure, bagging fragments, photographing everything, measuring distances down to the inch, because once you lift the earth, you can't put innocence back the way it was, not for the town, not for the family, not even for the investigators who had lived with this file like a weight in their desk drawer. By morning, the first whispers had already hardened into headlines. Found remains. Texas cold case. Community shocked. Unexpected suspect. Those words lit up screens in kitchens where coffee went cold untouched. They echoed through the diner in the clatter of plates and the hush between orders. They moved through church parking lots and hardware store aisles, and every time someone said Daniel Mercer's name out loud, it sounded wrong, like using the wrong word for something sacred. People argued about whether they felt betrayed or stupid, whether they had missed signs or whether there had never been signs at all, whether evil is loud or whether it learns to whisper so well it can sit next to you at Sunday service and never be recognized. Laura's sister arrived at the sheriff's office with her hands shaking, a grief so old it had become part of her posture, And when they told her they were waiting on confirmation, her face didn't change, because she had lived 22 years in a state of almost, and she knew better than to let hope rise too fast. Confirmation is a word that sounds clean until it lands in your life like a hammer. They asked her for DNA. A cheek swab. A simple gesture. A small, clinical act that carried the weight of an entire family's history. In a lab hours away, the process began. Extraction. Comparison. Statistical certainty built from microscopic truths. The science did what human memory could not. It did not care about stories or reputations or friendly smiles. It only cared about what the body kept when everything else was taken. When the results came back, the phrase was blunt, merciless, final, match. Laura Bennett was found. Not alive. Not whole. Not the way anyone had prayed. But found. And in the language of cold cases, found meant the universe had finally stopped hiding her. The sheriff called a press conference before the sun went down, because in towns like Red Hollow, if law enforcement doesn't speak, rumors will speak louder. Cameras lined up. Microphones clustered like metal flowers. The sheriff's voice was steady, but his eyes looked tired in a way that told you he had aged years in days. He used careful terms. Human remains. Positive identification. Ongoing investigation. Charges pending. He didn't say what the town wanted him to say, didn't offer the catharsis of certainty, because certainty is expensive and prosecutors don't spend it early. But the crowd heard what they needed anyway. Daniel Mercer. Arrested. In custody. Suspect. A woman in the back began to cry and didn't stop. Daniel sat in jail like a man listening to a storm from behind thick glass. He had lost his leverage, lost his map point, lost the illusion that he could decide the ending, and now he pivoted to the last thing he could still control, narrative. He wanted it framed as accident. He wanted it framed as panic. He wanted it framed as one terrible night instead of a life built on quiet predation. His lawyer leaned into that angle immediately, feeding the court language about lack of prior record, about cooperation, about the absence of premeditation, about the long passage of time, as if time itself could soften the truth. Investigators didn't buy it. They returned to the notebook. They returned to the old cooler. They returned to every late-night drive, every stopped vehicle, every place he stood by the roadside, as if waiting for memory to greet him. They understood something chilling now. If Daniel had been capable of keeping Laura hidden for 2 decades, he was capable of keeping other things hidden too. The notebook was sent to handwriting and behavioral analysts. The dates weren't random. They clustered. Some aligned with storms, nights when roads would be empty. Others aligned with community events, nights when people would be distracted, when a woman leaving work late might be one face among many. A phrase appeared more than once in Daniel's tight, slanted handwriting, 2 words that looked harmless until you read them in the new light of his confession: Good Road. Good Road meant opportunity. It meant darkness. It meant control. Investigators ran those dates through old police logs in surrounding counties. They weren't looking for murders. They were looking for anything: a call for help, a suspicious vehicle, a missing wallet, a woman who reported being followed, a 911 hang-up, a domestic disturbance on a rural route that didn't fit. Patterns emerged again, faint but persistent, like footprints in dust. A report from 1998 about a woman whose car was found abandoned near a drainage ditch. No body. No suspect. The case had gone nowhere and then been forgotten. Red Hollow wasn't ready to hear that. Red Hollow wanted one monster, one night, one victim, one story it could seal and bury. But the notebook refused to stay small. The notebook suggested a horizon wider than the town could handle. They brought Daniel back into the interview room and placed a photocopy of one page in front of him. One date circled. One location scribbled beside it. Not the gravel pit. A different place. Daniel stared at it too long before speaking, and that hesitation was a confession of its own. "You want to talk about Laura," he said carefully, as if trying to steer the ship back toward familiar waters. "That's what this is. One mistake." The investigator didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He tapped the circled date gently with a fingertip. "What happened here?" he asked. Daniel's eyes hardened. The mask came back. "Nothing," he said. The investigator leaned in slightly, voice low, surgical. "Don't do that. Not now. Not after we brought her back from the dirt." Daniel flinched at the word dirt, and it was subtle, but it was there, like a nerve exposed. In Red Hollow, the diner closed early that night. The staff couldn't pretend the coffee tasted the same. People sat in their cars in the parking lot and didn't go in. Some couldn't stop picturing Laura wiping down the counter on her last shift, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly, the door locking behind her, the night swallowing her steps. Others couldn't stop picturing Daniel inside that same diner days after she vanished, offering condolences, asking questions, inserting himself into the grief like he belonged there. Laura's sister stood at her mother's empty house and listened to the silence of rooms that had held 22 years of waiting. The closet still smelled faintly of her mother's perfume. There were old missing posters folded in a drawer, creased and worn from being handled too many times, as if touching paper could keep a person alive. She realized with a kind of bitter clarity that her mother had died without the one thing she wanted most, to bring Laura home with her own hands. The confirmation came too late for the person who had begged for it the longest. And then the town did what towns do when they are forced to see themselves in a harsh mirror. It looked for a way to redirect the shame. People blamed law enforcement for not catching Daniel sooner. People blamed Laura for trusting. People blamed the town for being too friendly, too naive, too eager to believe that familiarity equals safety. Nobody wanted to sit with the simplest, ugliest truth. Sometimes the predator doesn't need to hide, because the community hides him for free, wrapping him in normalcy and calling it character. The funeral home called and asked about arrangements even though there was barely anything to arrange. In cases like this, grief becomes an exercise in improvisation. A memorial without a body feels like a song without a melody. Laura's sister chose a photograph from 2000, Laura laughing on a porch swing, sunlight caught in her hair, a moment frozen before the world learned how to take her. The photo went to print. The town's bulletin boards filled again, but this time the posters weren't pleading for tips. They were announcements. Services. Vigils. Words like closure that never sound true in your mouth. The prosecutor's office prepared the case like a siege. They knew defense attorneys would weaponize every gap, no eyewitness, degraded physical evidence, the passage of time, alleged coercion in interrogation, alternative suspects long since dead or gone. So they built a story from what could not be argued: Daniel's proximity, his pattern of behavior, his notebook, his partial print, the witness identification in the later incident, his own words, and the grim fact of where Laura was found. They didn't need melodrama. The evidence was drama enough. On the eve of the arraignment, Daniel asked to see the investigator again. Not his lawyer. The investigator. It wasn't a right. It was a request. And the investigator agreed, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let a man like Daniel believe he still has an audience. Daniel walked in wearing jail clothes that made him look smaller, stripped of the town's familiar uniform of respectability. His eyes were tired. Not remorseful. Just tired, like the weight of maintaining a double life had finally become heavier than the consequences of being exposed. "I gave you what you wanted," Daniel said. The investigator didn't blink. "You gave us what you couldn't keep anymore." Daniel's mouth tightened. He stared at the table. Then he said, softly, almost casually, as if he were discussing whether, "They'll never forgive me." The investigator's voice was flat, controlled. "You're worried about forgiveness." Daniel looked up, and in his eyes was something cold, not pain, not guilt, but offense that the world had turned on him, as if he were the one betrayed. "You don't know what it's like," Daniel said. "To be watched." The investigator leaned back, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then, quietly, he said, "Laura knew." Daniel swallowed. His hands shifted. A crack. And in that crack, the case threatened to widen into something bigger than Red Hollow had ever imagined, because the notebook still sat in an evidence locker full of dates, and the old reports still waited in dusty cabinets. And the fear in Daniel's eyes wasn't about prison, it was about the possibility that Laura Bennett wasn't the only name about to rise from the dirt, and that the town's shock wasn't finished yet, not even close. The arraignment morning arrived with a sky that looked too clean for what Red Hollow was about to endure, because the town had been living inside a single headline for weeks, and now the headline was walking into a courtroom with shackles hidden under standard procedure. And everyone wanted the same impossible thing at once: answers without pain, justice without shame, closure without realizing what closure actually costs. The courthouse steps filled early, reporters adjusting lenses, locals holding their arms tight across their chests, as if bracing against wind that wasn't there, and somewhere behind the crowd Laura Bennett's sister stood in silence, staring at the door Daniel Mercer would come through, staring like she could with the last 22 years into reversing themselves. When Daniel entered, the room changed temperature without anyone saying a word. He moved slower than the memory of him did, smaller without the familiar clothes, stripped down to a man the town no longer recognized as its own, yet every person in that courtroom recognized him anyway, because recognition is the cruelest kind of evidence. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked forward. He looked like someone trying to survive being seen. The judge's voice was formal, procedural, almost indifferent, because the justice system does not mirror human emotion, it grinds through it. Charges were read. Obstruction. Evidence tampering. Murder charges poised on the edge of filing, dependent on what the prosecution could prove and what the defense could dismantle. Bail denied. Daniel's lawyer stood, calm, rehearsed, and requested time. Time, always time, the same currency Daniel had spent his whole life trading in. Outside the courthouse, the microphones waited like teeth. The sheriff delivered careful statements. The prosecutor delivered fewer. They didn't say what everyone wanted them to say, because saying too much is how cases fall apart. But the crowd heard what mattered anyway: this was real, and it wasn't over. Because that notebook still existed. The notebook sat in an evidence room like a pulse you could feel through the walls, and the more investigators looked at it, the less it felt like a man journaling, and the more it felt like a man cataloguing. Dates. Locations. Weather notes. Two-word phrases that looked harmless until you understood they were coded for opportunity. Good road. Quiet night. Late shift. No moon. The words had a chill to them, not because they were dramatic, but because they were practical. Evil written in shorthand. Analysts built a timeline that spanned decades, and in that timeline there were black holes where reports had been filed and forgotten. A 1998 abandoned car case. A 2003 attempted road blocking encounter. A 2006 woman reporting a man helping her with directions, then following her for miles until she turned into a police station parking lot. None of these cases had ever been tied together because the towns were different, the jurisdictions were different, the victims survived, or the victims didn't leave enough evidence for anyone to keep caring. But patterns don't respect county lines. Patterns just keep repeating until somebody finally listens. Investigators pulled those files one by one. The way you pull loose threads you're afraid will unravel the whole garment, and the more they pulled, the more they realized something terrifying. Daniel Mercer may not have been a man who snapped once. He may have been a man who practiced. They requested state assistance again, this time not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. The cold case unit expanded its search radius. They entered Daniel's name into systems that hadn't existed in 2001. They matched vehicle descriptions. They matched behavior profiles. They matched the phrase "block the road" and "headlights flashing" and "something wrong with your car" across decades of reports. The results didn't come back as a clean list. They came back as a messy cluster of maybes, the kind of maybes that make your stomach drop because you can't unsee them once they appear. Daniel's lawyer tried to narrow the narrative fast. One victim. One event. One tragic outcome. Panic. Accident. The words were chosen carefully, because the defense doesn't need to prove innocence, it only needs to fracture certainty. But the prosecutor saw the trap. If Daniel could be framed as a one-time offender, the town could breathe again. If Daniel was framed as a long-term predator, the town would never be able to pretend it didn't host him. So the prosecutor did something that changed everything. He authorized investigators to confront Daniel with the notebook as a whole, not as a single page, not as a single date, but as a map. In the interview room, they laid photocopies across the table like a spread of cards. Daniel's eyes flicked from one to the next, and for a moment he looked exposed in a way no accusation could achieve. Because you can deny a story. You can't deny your own handwriting. That's not what it looks like, Daniel said immediately, too quickly, a reflex, a man trying to outrun his own evidence. What does it look like? The investigator asked, voice low, controlled. Daniel swallowed. Notes. Places I drove. Things I saw. The investigator tapped one phrase. Late shift. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then another. No moon. Then another. Good road. Daniel's hands curled slightly on the edge of the table, white knuckles appearing like a confession under the skin. You're telling me you keep weather notes for casual drives? The investigator asked. Daniel leaned back, trying to reclaim space. People write things down. The investigator's voice stayed steady. You didn't write down birthdays. You didn't write down anniversaries. You wrote down nights. Daniel stared at the paper like it was a stranger he couldn't argue with. And then the investigator did what he'd been waiting to do. He slid a photograph across the table. Not Laura. Not the gravel pit. A black and white printout of an old police report photo from 1998. An abandoned sedan, driver's door open, sitting at an angle near a drainage ditch, weeds crawling up around the tires like nature trying to swallow evidence. Daniel's face barely changed. Barely. But his eyes did. His pupils tightened like someone had turned on a light inside his head. That wasn't me, Daniel said. Nobody had asked yet. The air went thin. The investigator didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You recognized it. Daniel's breathing changed, quickened, then slowed as he tried to regain control. It's the kind of thing you see on the news," he said, and it sounded like a man improvising while he ran out of room. The investigator let the silence stretch until it became a blade. Then he said, "We are going to find out who you were while everyone thought you were just Daniel Mercer." Daniel stared back, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that looked like calculation mixed with fear, the look of a man realizing the story is no longer his to manage. Days turned into a second storm. Search warrants expanded. Investigators returned to Daniel's property with new eyes, not searching for Laura now, but searching for the ways he might have recorded or preserved moments he thought belonged to him. They pulled up old floorboards. They scanned walls. They checked crawl spaces again. They found nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, nothing that would satisfy the public's hunger for a monster's lair, and that absence was its own horror, because it suggested Daniel didn't need trophies. He didn't need souvenirs. He needed the act itself. The control. The secret. The knowledge that he could walk among them untouched. Then a technician reviewing digital archives found something small that hit like a fist, a set of photographs stored on a decades-old memory card recovered from Daniel's garage, buried in a box of discarded electronics. The images were low resolution, time-stamped, ordinary at first glance: empty roads, rural intersections, night skies with no moon, a diner parking lot from a distance. Surveillance without a badge. Observation without permission. In one frame, far in the background, a woman stood outside the diner, locking the door, turning toward her truck. The timestamp read April 12, 2001. The room went silent when investigators saw it. Not because it confirmed what they already believed, but because it showed planning. It showed stalking. It erased the defense's favorite word in one strike: accident. They didn't need Daniel to confess anymore. They needed Daniel to explain what else he had recorded, what else he had watched, what else he had done. The prosecutor filed upgraded charges within 48 hours. Murder. Kidnapping. Premeditation argued through documentation. The town watched the update on local news like it was a funeral announcement for their own former innocence. Red Hollow began to fracture in ways nobody could control. People stopped trusting familiar faces. Women stopped driving alone at night. Old friends began recounting small moments they'd ignored years ago: Daniel offering to walk someone to their car, Daniel showing up, by coincidence, on a road where nobody had a reason to be, Daniel asking questions that felt like concern until you realized concern can be a mask that never slips until it's too late. And in the middle of it all, Laura's sister stood in her kitchen holding the printed photo of Laura locking the diner door, staring at the grainy silhouette like it was a portal to the last normal second of her sister's life, the last moment before the headlights, the lie, the pullover, the vanishing. She pressed her fingers to the paper and felt nothing but ink and helplessness. Daniel's lawyer requested suppression hearings immediately, arguing chain of custody, arguing coercion, arguing the passage of time, arguing that old evidence is fragile and therefore unfair. The prosecutor welcomed the fight. Because the prosecutor now had something better than a confession, a documented timeline of obsession. In jail, Daniel learned what it meant to be ordinary the way he feared most. Not ordinary as in harmless. Ordinary as in powerless. Other inmates knew his name now. Guards knew it too. He was no longer a quiet man with a quiet case. He was the face on the television in the break room. He was the subject of whispers in the corridor. He was watched, constantly, the way he had once watched others. And in that surveillance, something inside him began to crack again, not from guilt, but from the unbearable reversal of control. One night, after lights out, Daniel requested a meeting. Emergency. He claimed he had information. He claimed he wanted to clear something up. The sheriff's office was notified. The prosecutor was notified. The investigator, who had been in the room when Daniel first asked, "Do you know how long it's been?" was called back in. When Daniel sat down this time, his hands were shaking openly. Not theatrically. Not convincingly, either. Shaking like a man trying to decide whether to detonate the last thing he still had. "You're going to make me into a monster," Daniel said, voice strained, bitter. The investigator's eyes didn't soften. "You did that?" Daniel stared hard, jaw working. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "I wasn't the only one who knew her schedule." The room went still. The investigator didn't move. "What are you saying?" Daniel swallowed, eyes darting, calculating again. "I'm saying you're looking at me like I'm the whole answer. Like I did it all alone." The investigator leaned forward a fraction, voice low, lethal in its calm. "Say it." Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "There was someone else," he said. And in that moment, the town's shock, already stretched to its limit, found a new edge, because an unexpected suspect was one thing, but the suggestion of a second shadow, someone who watched Laura too, someone who knew what Daniel knew, threatened to turn Red Hollow's nightmare into something larger than a single name, larger than a single arrest, larger than any headline could contain. The cold case wasn't ending. It was splitting open. Daniel Mercer's words hung in the air like a second set of headlights appearing in the rearview mirror when you thought you were alone on the road, and the investigator didn't move, because moving too quickly in a moment like this can turn a crack into a sealed door, can turn a confession into performance, can let a man like Daniel turn truth into smoke. Daniel's hands trembled on the tabletop, not with remorse, not with fear of what he'd done, but with something sharper, something uglier, panic at losing control of the only currency he had left, information. "Someone else," the investigator said, voice low, measured, each word a nail. "Name?" Daniel's jaw worked like he was chewing on a bitter piece of metal. He glanced toward the corner of the room where the camera blinked its indifferent red light, and the glance said everything. He wasn't afraid of the camera. He was afraid of what the camera would carry out of this room. "If I say it," Daniel murmured, "you'll never stop." The investigator leaned forward just enough to make the air tighten. "We don't stop anyway." Daniel let out a thin, humorless laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're doing this for her," he said. "You think it's about Laura." "It is," the investigator said. Daniel shook his head slowly, like a man disappointed by someone else's innocence. "It's about you," he whispered. "About what you can't stand not knowing." The investigator didn't blink. "Name?" Daniel stared at his own hands, as if they belonged to someone else. Then he spoke, and his voice dropped further, forcing the room to lean toward him, forcing the truth to arrive like a poisoned carrot in a spoon. "You've interviewed him," he said. "Back then." The investigator's stomach tightened, but his face stayed flat, because reaction is what Daniel wanted, reaction is what turns a hint into power. "Who?" the investigator said. Daniel's lips pressed together. A long silence. The kind of silence that tells you the next word will not be free. "He's his respected," Daniel said finally, and the word landed like a blade on a wooden table, because in towns like Red Hollow, respect is a shield, respect is a hiding place, respect is the thing people cling to when they want to believe their world is safe. The investigator's voice sharpened, still quiet. "You're trying to poison the town." Daniel's eyes flashed. "I'm telling you what you missed." "Name?" Daniel swallowed hard. His gaze flicked up, met the investigator's eyes for the first time, with something like defiance. I want guarantees, he said. I want to know I'm not walking into. You're not walking anywhere, the investigator cut in, calm as ice. You're in a cage. You're asking for guarantees like you still have choices. Daniel's breathing quickened, then steadied again, as he forced himself back into calculation. Then don't act surprised when you find out you weren't the only one who looked the other way, he said, and it sounded like accusation, like revenge, like a man trying to make the world as dirty as he was so he wouldn't have to sit alone in his filth. The meeting ended without a name, but it ended with something nearly as dangerous, a direction. The investigator walked out into a corridor that smelled like disinfectant and old sweat, and he could already feel the next wave coming, the wave that would hit Red Hollow not as a single blow, but as a slow drowning, because if Daniel was telling the truth, the case didn't just involve a predator, it involved a failure. A blind spot. A gap wide enough for someone else to slip through. Back at the sheriff's office, they pulled the 2001 interview logs and laid them out like a town's yearbook of the living and the dead. Names. Addresses. Notes written by hands long retired. Familiar faces. Men who'd since become grandparents, men who'd moved away, men who'd died. The list felt like a minefield, because any name on it could be a second monster, or an innocent dragged into darkness by a liar's last bargain. They started with the people Daniel would want to hurt, not the people he'd want to protect. That was the rule with men like him. When they can't control the ending, they try to burn the stage down on their way out. So investigators asked themselves a brutal question: who in Red Hollow benefited from doubt, from chaos, from the town turning on itself? Who did Daniel resent? Who had testified, who had criticized, who had quietly withdrawn support? A name surfaced in whispers almost immediately, not from evidence, but from the way people's voices shifted when it was spoken: Sheriff Tom Harlan, the man who had overseen the case in 2001, a respected figure. A man who had walked Laura's mother to her car after vigils. A man who had promised answers and then watched the file turn cold. Harlan was retired now, older, living quietly on the edge of town, his public reputation intact like a polished badge hung on a wall. The investigator felt the trap the moment the name was written down. It fit Daniel's hint too perfectly. Respected. Interviewed. Back then. And it was exactly the kind of accusation that would rip Red Hollow open from the inside, because if the sheriff was implicated, then the town didn't just fail to see a predator, it may have been led by someone who helped him. They didn't rush to confront Harlan. They didn't whisper it to the media. They moved like surgeons, because the damage from being wrong would be catastrophic. They pulled Harlan's old notes. Compared handwriting. Compared times. Compared call logs. Checked whether Harlan had ever deviated from standard procedure. They found nothing overt. No smoking gun. No missing evidence bag with his name on it. But they did find something unsettling. A gap in the record on the night Laura disappeared. A window of time where the dispatch logs were incomplete, where calls were noted without details. In 2001, it could have been sloppy documentation. In 2025, under the harsh light of Daniel Mercer's accusation, it looked like a shadow. They interviewed Harlan quietly at his home. He opened the door with the same steady confidence he'd carried for decades, the posture of a man who expects respect because he has always received it. When he heard Daniel's name, his face tightened, not with guilt, but with anger, the kind of anger that comes from being dragged back into a story you thought time had buried. "You're telling me that Animal is trying to blame me," Harlan said, voice sharp. "After what he did?" The investigator watched him carefully. "He says you knew her schedule." Harlan's eyes narrowed. Everyone knew her schedule. The diner closed the same time every night. The answer was logical. Too logical. The investigator felt the chill of it, not as proof, but as reminder. Truth and manipulation can sound identical when spoken with confidence. They pressed gently, then harder. Harlan's story stayed consistent. He admitted the file was messy. He admitted mistakes. He admitted he had underestimated the case at first, that he had believed Laura might return, that he had tried to keep panic from spreading. He denied any involvement beyond that. He said Daniel Mercer was a liar. He said Daniel Mercer was trying to scorch the earth. It could have been true. It could have been a perfect lie. The prosecutor refused to let the accusation hijack the murder case. The evidence against Daniel was now too strong to risk collapsing under a side war. So they split the path. Daniel Mercer would face trial for Laura Bennett, while a separate task force quietly investigated the possibility of an accomplice. Two parallel currents moving through the same dark water. Red Hollow watched the trial begin like a storm rolling in slow motion. The courtroom filled again, the same faces, the same microphones, the same sick fascination. The prosecution displayed the memory card photographs, the time-stamped surveillance of Laura locking the diner door, the notebook with its coded phrases, the soil analysis, the partial print, the witness from the neighboring county, and finally the forensic confirmation from the gravel pit. Each exhibit stripped another layer of the town's denial away. People cried. People stared. People looked down at their hands, as if they didn't recognize the life that had been living right next to them. Daniel sat at the defense table and listened to his own story being told without him, and you could see the thing he feared most arriving in real time. He was becoming ordinary in the ugliest way. Not ordinary as in harmless, but ordinary as in known. Exposed. Documented. Reduced to evidence and procedure. The town wasn't imagining him anymore. The town was learning him. When the defense tried to float the word accident, the prosecutor crushed it with the photograph from April 12, 2001, the Quiet Stalker's frame frozen in pixels. Accident doesn't take pictures first. Accident doesn't write late shift in a notebook. Accident doesn't pick a place no one would think to search, and then live with it for 22 years. Daniel did not testify. He watched. He waited. He flinched only once, when Laura's sister took the stand and described the sound of the phone not ringing, night after night, year after year, the way silence becomes its own kind of violence. Her voice didn't shake when she spoke Laura's name. It was steadier than steel. And in that steadiness was the thing Daniel could never bargain with, love that refuses to be negotiated. The jury deliberated longer than the town could breathe comfortably. Red Hollow held itself in a suspended inhale, and in that inhale old relationships snapped, old friendships cracked, because people couldn't stop replaying their lives. Daniel at the grocery store, Daniel at church, Daniel waving from his porch. And each replay felt like contamination. When the verdict came back, guilty, it did not explode into cheers. It settled like ash. Some people wept. Some people stared straight ahead. Some people closed their eyes like they were trying to keep the image of Laura locking that diner door from ever forming again in their mind. The judge sentenced Daniel Mercer to life, and for a moment the town thought it had reached the end of the nightmare, because we all want the world to behave like a story. Villain caught, chapter closed, peace restored. But outside the courthouse, the investigator stood alone for a second, listening to the wind slide between buildings, because peace is not restored by a verdict. Peace is restored by answers. And there was still a question coiled inside the case like a second serpent, the someone else. The task force continued quietly, relentlessly, checking every interview from 2001, every dispatch gap, every overlooked tip, every road Daniel liked to call good. They interviewed more women, and in those interviews the town heard something it could not unhear, There had been other close calls, other moments dismissed as odd, other headlights on empty roads, other men who sounded concerned until concern became a trap. Not all of them pointed to Daniel. Not all of them made sense. The pattern widened and blurred, and that blur was its own horror, because it meant the town's fear no longer had one face. Weeks later, Daniel requested another meeting. He offered to help again. This time, he wanted something new. He wanted to know what the investigation found. He wanted to hear how much chaos he had caused. He wanted to taste the town's panic like oxygen. The investigator sat across from him and said nothing for a long time, letting the silence remind Daniel who held the power now. "Are you still looking?" Daniel asked, voice low. The investigator leaned in slightly. "We never stopped." Daniel's smile twitched. "You won't find what you want," he whispered. The investigator's voice stayed calm, a blade drawn slowly. "Maybe we won't. But we'll keep digging. And you'll live every day knowing you didn't get to choose the ending." Daniel's smile faded. His eyes hardened. And for the first time, he looked truly trapped, not by bars, not by chains, but by the thought of people searching beyond him, past him, under him, into the parts of his life he hadn't managed to control. That night, Red Hollow held a memorial by the roadside where Laura's truck had once been found, candles trembling in the wind, their flame small but defiant. People stood close together without touching, as if contact could transfer blame. Laura's sister placed a single photograph on the hood of a car, the same grainy image of Laura locking the diner door, and the candlelight flickered across it, making it look, for a second, like Laura might turn back toward the camera, might step out of the frame, might come home. But she didn't. The candles burned down slowly, and when they went out, darkness returned the way it always does, quiet, complete, indifferent. Cars drove away in cautious lines. Porch lights clicked on across town. Doors locked. Curtains closed. And County Road 17 lay empty again, the same strip of asphalt that had swallowed a woman in 2001 and then waited 22 years to give her back in pieces. Somewhere in the jail, Daniel Mercer lay awake listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, knowing the town was finally watching him the way he had watched others, and knowing that even with the verdict, even with the remains recovered, even with his name cemented in history as the unexpected suspect, there was still a shadow he had pointed at. A shadow he may have invented, a shadow that might be real, a shadow that would keep Red Hollow awake for years, because the most haunting cold cases are not the ones where the killer is never caught, but the ones where the killer is caught and the questions keep living anyway, crawling through the cracks of ordinary life, whispering the same thing into the dark long after the cameras leave. What else did we miss? Who else did we trust? And how many nights did the town sleep safely only because the predator decided not to move?